Our first speaker today is Austin Haney, and he's going to be presenting Entirely Uncomfortable, Frontier Army Life on the Upper Missouri. Um, Austin has been passionate about Montana's story since childhood. A Central Montana native, he has worked for a variety of history organizations on the private, state, and national level, and has presented cultural and historical programming for groups like Montana Historical Society, Lewis and Clark National Historic Trail Heritage Foundation, Montana State Parks, and Humanities Montana. And he's on his way to Fort Benton after this to give another presentation. A graduate of the University of Montana, go Briz. He has spent much of the past 4 years telling the Nez Perce story in Montana with the National Park Service, the Bear Paw Battlefield, Nez Perce National Historic Park, and Blaine County Museum in Chinook. And welcome, Austin.
All right. Can you guys hear me just fine? Awesome. I'm used to shouting on an open, windy battlefield, so bear with me if I'm a little loud. So Frontier Army, it's an interesting chapter in Montana's history, and I think one that has a tendency to be a little over-romanticized. I mean, when you guys hear Frontier Army, what do you guys think of? You know, John Wayne riding to the rescue kind of thing, you know, things like that. The reality is a lot different. And so let's go meet some of our soldiers of the 1870s. So the Army of the Frontier is often characterized as an army of misfits. They're commonly stereotyped as the bottom of the barrel of American society. The truth is kind of somewhere in between that and John Wayne. They're just people. It's a cross-section of American society representing all economic levels, trades. It's about 2/3 immigrants, mostly from Great Britain, Ireland, Germany. But you have people from Brazil, from Turkey, Russia, anywhere in the world, you have representatives in the U.S. Army of the 1870s. So this is a really interesting time. It's a transition period both for the military as well as the area of Montana as we know it today. We are coming out of the Civil War. It's gone from a military that, you know, marches shoulder to shoulder in these big lines, fighting like it's the Revolutionary War still. And they come out of the Civil War completely changed. You see photos from the early days. It looks, again, like something Napoleon or George Washington would recognize. By the end of that war, it's looking closer to World War I. So there's a lot of technological revolution going on in the military at the time. There is a lot of training and just philosophy that the military is going through. Do we have any veterans in the room or anybody who has family who served? Yeah. So there are a lot of different reasons why people enlisted at the time and a lot of different philosophies behind it. But you guys might start recognizing this army in the 1870s. I like to say it's the birth of the modern U.S. Army. It's the beginnings of things like basic training, if any of you have gone through that. It is catering towards specialized equipment, specialized training, but it's all in the infancy. They're having to take baby steps, and there's going to be a lot of missteps along the way. Of course, generals, congressmen, and good ideas. Much like today, the U.S. government is notoriously cheap on some things. And they have a lot of good ideas as to what these guys are going to be doing, what they're going to be using. Oftentimes, it's not a good idea. You guys ever think that putting a bayonet on the end of a rifle and using it as a shovel is a good idea? Well, you guys might want to get a time machine and try and tell the U.S. Army that. But beyond that, all of this actually does lead to some menial improvements, both in terms of the quality of training, the quality of equipment, and just generally the way the Army wants to be going into the future. By the time this period of experimentation is over, of which our poor guys in the 1870s are going to be probably the biggest guinea pigs of all, the Army that comes out of this is going to be the one that marches off towards World War I in the modern era. So now that we kind of know a little bit about who we're dealing with, let's talk about where. So I just want you guys to know all of these slide titles come from actual quotes said about military life in Montana. Abandon hope upon entering. Stated when a poor soldier saw his barracks building for the first time. So the first military post in Montana that we're going to talk about, Camp Cooke. Has anybody gone down through the Missouri Breaks on a canoe trip ever? Has anybody? What's that country like? It's rough. It's remote. Would you guys build a fort there? Probably not. You guys have more sense than military commanders in the 1860s and 70s. But Camp Cooke, it's built at the mouth of the Judith River in the literal middle of nowhere. And almost from the get-go, people realized that this probably wasn't the best place to put a fort. Some of the journals that you read of privates there talk about, oh, the rats are eating my shoes now, and oh, they ate a hole in my tent, and so-and-so got shot by a Sioux in the bushes the other day. It's not fun stuff. So pretty quickly, they're looking for excuses to get out of Camp Cooke. As early as the fall of 1866, they're sending battalions out to search for new locations. And one of these is going to actually develop into Fort Shaw. So if you guys are going on the Fort Shaw tour tomorrow, you guys are going to be ahead of the game. So Fort Shaw really takes over and kind of becomes the queen of Montana posts after its founding. And then also kind of a main substation we're going to talk about is Fort Benton. Did anybody go on the Fort Benton tour? Awesome. One of my favorite places in Montana. But it was a summer installation as early as 1866. By 1869, it's going to be year-round, full-time. So this is a lovely illustration of Camp Cooke. Again, when Montana people in the 1860s are complaining that this is in the middle of nowhere and it does absolutely nothing, you might have a problem. So most of this was torn down and brought to Fort Benton or Fort Shaw or just completely sold off. Again, Fort Shaw, wonderful, wonderful. Most of these buildings are gone now, unfortunately. But you can kind of see the difference in quality between Camp Cooke and Fort Shaw, even just a year apart. And the real cool thing about these posts is a lot of the construction material is Adobe. So amongst the many random Scooby-Doo adventures in my life, I worked at an Adobe fort and learned how to make it. And this is actual Fort Benton Adobe. Some of you guys might recognize that. But Adobe is a wonderful construction material. It's very insulating. It keeps you warm in the winter because it keeps the cold out. And in the summertime, it keeps you cool because it keeps the heat out. There's only a couple problems with Adobe. Adobe's fragile. It's needy. You have to take care of it. If you don't, all of a sudden you don't have Adobe anymore. Now, I don't know about you guys, but random folks off the street today, do you guys think that you'd be master Adobe Masons? You'd know how to take care of it? Do you suppose that John Q. Soldier taken off the streets of New York City or just hopped off a boat from Ireland, are they going to be master Adobe Masons? Absolutely not. Hence, abandon hope upon entering. These things would disintegrate if you weren't careful. So one of the things they did at Fort Shaw, and you'll see this, but they sided the buildings at the post in wood. It also makes it look like it's not Adobe. So that is just kind of what makes our military posts out here unique. You don't see Adobe. And how many of you guys thought that we had Adobe here in Montana and such a rich legacy in it? I'm glad to see some hands. Unfortunately, we've lost knowledge of it, but it's still quite the cool piece. With more Adobe, you got to mix more mud, you got to put it on and hope for the best. So what do you think these guys are doing? Are they out being active and busy most of the time? No. Our veterans, you might recognize the phrase hurry up and wait. Yeah. Most of their lives were pretty boring and dull, literally the dullness of our lives. Some of the things about it, post routine, this is probably 80-90% of your life as a soldier. You get up, you do your roll call, you have breakfast, you do the chores around the post. You might do some drill if you've got an officer who's really interested in it. Then you have your lunch, you do some more chores, maybe some more drill, dinner, rinse, repeat. Congratulations, that is going to be most of your time in 5 years of an enlistment. Who wants to sign on the dotted line and become a soldier? No takers? Oh boy. So drill, training, and the lack thereof. If you were lucky, again, I said, this is the start of basic training. What that entails is basically you sign your enlistment papers, you get sent to a recruiting depot. You might get trained for about a week or two in how to march around, stand at attention, and stand in a straight line. And that's about it. After that, it's give them a uniform and a bag and good luck. You'll learn the rest on the job. And it's really up to individual officers and post commanders on just what they're going to do. If you read the records of the 7th Infantry, which was the main regiment out at Fort Shaw and its feeder posts in the 1870s, inspection reports talk about how these guys don't know how to do drill whatsoever. They don't do it, they don't practice it, but they do target practice, which is kind of a weird thing for the 1870s military. Most of the time it was stand in a line, everybody shoot at the same time, good luck, you might hit something. They allocated roughly 6 rounds of ammunition for target practice a month. What's that gonna do? Diddly squat. So the 7th was kind of different and an outlier in that most other regiments, they're not really practicing, but the 7th is. So again, very, very boring, very routine lives. The little social amusements they have are very broad and diverse, if you will. It's surprising. Did you guys know that they had a theater troupe at Fort Shaw? No, the soldiers would put plays on for each other. There were book clubs. Anybody part of a book club here? Awesome. You guys would fit in the 1870s. But book clubs, there were fraternal organizations. The Odd Fellows were very popular at Fort Shaw. There was even a temperance society because probably the number one social amusement of all was getting drunk down at the settler store. So, but probably the most enriching and the most near and dear to the heart of the soldier as far as amusements go is the regimental band. So say hello to the 5th Infantry Band. They are at the dedication of the Golden Spike outside of Gold Creek, Montana. I unfortunately couldn't track down an image of the 7th Infantry Band, but as you guys can see, these are the peacocks of the fort. They would play for all social occasions, balls, holidays. They often threw dances and parties that they could go to. If they were lucky, they might get some of the ladies from Sun River to come by. but most of the time it was stag dances, men dancing with other men. But the regimental bands were a beloved part of every post that was lucky enough to have them. You only had them at the headquarters. So wherever the colonel is, that's where the band is. So sorry for you boys at Fort Benton, but you don't get a concert. So food. Oh boy, this is one of the most fun things to talk about. Rations in the military at this time are abysmal. You guys ever heard of something called hardtack? Yep. It's called that for a reason. I wish I had a piece here, but I could tap it on this table and you'd think someone was trying to get in the door. You don't want to eat that just straight. You're going to break your teeth. I would know. Yeah, rip my molar. But anyways, hardtack is purposefully made that hard so it doesn't spoil. It's very long-lived. So long-lived, in fact, that there were posts in Montana that had hardtack boxes dated 15 years prior from the Civil War. It already was pretty unedible. Do you guys want to be eating 15-year-old unedible nonsense? Probably not. So military rations being what they were, they often improvised quite a bit. The soldiers at Fort Shaw were very well known for being excellent gardeners. Can you guys just imagine seeing those soldiers in their goofy blue suits, you know, hoeing a field outside Fort Shaw? But no, that's what they did. It was oftentimes the only way to get fresh vegetables. They would import fruit from California, canned fruit, believe it or not. There was already an industry for that going on. They could bring in all sorts of goodies from the Helena area, some of Montana's first microbreweries, if you will. They would buy beer and ship it up to Fort Shaw on the Mullen Road. They also would replace their hardtack with Montana Steam Crackers. Anybody ever heard of that? Montana Steam Cracker Company? Basically, it's a fancy schmancy machine that makes softer hardtack. And it's steam powered. So, as you can see, it pays to shop local, even in the 1870s. But as you can see by this picture here, once you get out on campaign in the field, you're away from the fort, everything goes out the window. This is a delightful image from the horse meat march. I wonder why they call it that. But these poor fellows have been campaigning in kind of the Wyoming, southern Montana area and went on a little detour through the Black Hills of South Dakota. Needless to say, they ran out of just about everything and were reduced to eating horses and mules. If you were a little bit luckier, you might shoot some bison, but, well, as we know in the 1870s, the bison are getting fewer and fewer. And unfortunately for these soldiers, no bison steaks. Speaking of our friend the sutler, not only does he sell alcohol at the fort, but sometimes these guys were very enterprising entrepreneurs. There's a story of a fellow that I lovingly refer to as Colonel Taters. He was a man from Bozeman who came up with the genius idea of dragging a boat over Bozeman Pass and dropping it into the Yellowstone near Livingston, loaded with potatoes. And this guy rode all the way down the Yellowstone River just so he could sell potatoes to infantrymen on campaign in 1876. Pretty crazy. They complained, of course, that he charged way too ridiculous prices for everything, but what do you know? They wanted their potatoes. So I'll share one more quote from this just because I like it and gives you an idea of some of what these guys could experience closer to air quotes civilization. Sylvester Waltz, he's a private in the 7th Infantry. He was complaining that he didn't get any potatoes, but he got beans. And that night, he and his friends made bean soup. And he said it was as good to us as ice cream to a child. So, and of course, this is the flashy stuff. This is what everybody knows when you think of the Frontier Army, the actual going out and fighting part. And this was a very minuscule part of their lives. Most people in their enlistments never saw in anything as far as combat goes. There are some examples of 7th Infantry companies that in all this chaos in the 1870s, as you can see, there's several different campaigns. In all those campaigns, there were several companies that never did anything. They never left their forts. How much of that was because they were probably the poorest trained company in the regiment? I don't know, but sometimes I guess it pays to be terrible soldiers, I guess. So most of what they're doing when they actually leave the forts and go out, it's not fighting per se. It's escort duty and summer stations. So escorting can range anywhere from paymasters, from mail, anything like that that needs a little bit of extra oomph. They can go out and help that. Likewise, believe it or not, the 7th Infantry oftentimes escorted Salish, Pend Oreille, and Kootenai hunting parties, as well as the Nez Perce when they'd come to Montana to hunt buffalo. It's this interesting juxtaposition of our normal view of the frontier soldier riding alongside indigenous people to the buffalo grounds. Of course, these same soldiers in 1877 are going to be used to hunt down and attack these same people. So if anyone knows about the story of the Battle of Big Hole, Montana was a real small place back then. People knew each other, maybe not by name, but they recognized people. Just like I'm sure some of us recognize each other right now today. And so some of that hurt and anguish that comes from Big Hole is not just the violence of that moment, it's the betrayal of people you thought you knew. So some of the big campaigns that soldiers from Fort Shaw, Fort Benton are involved with, the earliest one goes back to 1870. Who's heard of the Marias Massacre? Yeah, I'm unfortunately glad to see so many hands. But troops from Fort Shaw were participants in that event. It was sort of their first baptism under fire. But the big thing, so quick side tangent, one of my programs for Humanities Montana, I talk about railroad surveys. And in the 1870s, the Northern Pacific Railroad is trying to survey a route through the Yellowstone. And let's just say that our friends, the Sioux, the Lakota Nation, they have a few things to say about that. And soldiers from Fort Shaw are going to come down and try and meet the Eastern Survey Party, and they're going to figure out where's the best place to put a railroad. So there are a couple fights that go on through this time. I think my favorite moment in that, has anybody ever heard the story of Sitting Bull, how in one fight with soldiers, he went out in between the lines where everyone was fighting. He sat down and he just calmly smoked his pipe. That was against soldiers from Fort Shaw. Obviously, that target practice did almost nothing. That's kind of the thing. People ask about that story. Oh, how is that possible? And I just tell them, you don't know the Frontier Army. They probably couldn't hit the broadside of a barn, most of them. But all this chaos with the railroad surveys is really going to lead up to probably the big, famous campaign in Montana history that culminates in Little Bighorn. There is 3 columns of soldiers out that summer, one from the Dakotas, one from Wyoming. Those are the horse meat folks. And then, of course, the Montana column. And one of these fellows that was in there who wrote a wonderful account of it, very detailed, is early Montana historian James Bradley. He's a lieutenant in the 7th Infantry. And they're going down, and honestly, they know something is going to happen that summer. The journals of these infantrymen, they talk about the trepidation of being out on their own. The Montana column's the first one in the field, and they are without any support from anybody for a period of almost 2 months. And they talk about this experience. They're camped on the Yellowstone, and they see off in the distance smoke from probably Sioux Village. And up until that time, if they'd been discovered, that village would disappear, it would go away. And all these journals note that they're kind of freaked out when the next morning the smoke is closer. They're not afraid of these soldiers. They know something's going to happen that summer. And it's the soldiers from Fort Shaw acting in concert with the Dakota column, of which one yellow-haired horse-riding fella by the name of Custer is part of. They're the ones who find the carnage at Little Bighorn. Now, loaded question that I'm not really going to ask, but I want you guys to imagine, veterans today, we know all this stuff about PTSD today. They didn't know it back then. But do you guys think that these soldiers would have gone through that experience completely unaffected? Probably not. And kind of the last big campaign, I already touched on it, Big Hole. The thing about that, again, they were familiar with who they were fighting. More times than not, these soldiers would meet these groups of indigenous folks traveling on more or less friendly terms. I should mention that you read these accounts, you read what they're talking about, this dilemma they're facing in going out on these campaigns is, well, you're dealing with a lot of Civil War veterans. As Chris Latre very eloquently spoke to, being in Gettysburg and seeing these people that are heralded as heroes from the Civil War. These same men who, after 4 years of blood and carnage that ends in the freedom of over 4 million people, a decade later, they are out here tasked with taking that freedom away from others. And not everyone wrestled with that. Not everybody felt awful about what they were doing. There were some truly bad eggs in the military at the time, but it's the same through time, unfortunately. But you read some of the accounts where they truly are really grappling with that issue. And the Nez Perce situation is one of those stories. Again, they knew these people. There are accounts of soldiers finding women killed in the camp that they recognized. It's brutal stuff. And I wish I had time to speak to that, but I just want you guys to know the thing that hit me when I worked with the National Park Service. There's a poignant bronze at the entrance to the visitor center there, and it's a native girl's doll next to a soldier's boot print and a spent shell. And it was already very powerful, but I realized one day that boot print from the soldier was my shoe size. We don't know what we would have done 150 years ago. Maybe we would have been one of the better soldiers that grappled with this. Maybe we wouldn't. We don't know. But part of why I do this, talking about these guys, is most of them didn't want to be out here. Most of them would much rather not be sitting at a tent in the middle of the Missouri Breaks or out on the Yellowstone. Most of them would much rather have had a normal 9-to-5 job back in an eastern city. But circumstances are what they are. Again, veterans, we know that people enlist for different reasons. There are honorable ones and there are dishonorable ones. And the truth really lies somewhere along the end of the trail when we look back. These men, again, they're not John Wayne riding to the rescue. They're just human beings for all that's worth. Of course, the most common way most of them stayed in Montana would be, well, you see the little white tombstones. But many of those that served would retire here. They would spend the rest of their lives in Montana. Many of Great Falls' early citizens, Fort Benton's early citizens, are former infantrymen from the posts around here. And the legacies are complicated. I know people who have family ties to these stories, to these people. And it's difficult history, but it's worthwhile. Because at the end of the day, we're all human beings. And I think that's something we should all remember, regardless of whether we wear the blues or not. So with that, thank you all. If you guys want to know more about this kind of stuff, the National Archives has a wonderful array of materials written by these folks. You can find a lot of these journals publicly, and then of course the Montana Historical Society. Once it's back up and running, you guys best believe I'm going to be pouring through James Bradley's stuff once more.